If you have your Bibles, or if there's a Bible within reach, maybe on the rack, or maybe one that someone has in their lap that they're not using, need you to find in the New Testament, Gospel according to Luke. Going to be chapter 15. When you find that, Luke chapter 15, kind of open it up and find verse 11. That's where we're going to be starting when I get there. Okay? If you come over to the house, which you're always welcome to do, you're within reason, Down in the lower depths of the house, there's our little video shelf. And as guys have been moving out, they've been kind of taking their videos with them, as far as the things that they like. But we still have a pretty decent collection of videos. And really, if you kind of sort it through, you can kind of look and kind of see there's kind of Jen's videos. You know what I mean? Sleepless in Seattle, An Affair to Remember, Cinderella, the live-action Cinderella that I've never seen. That sort of stuff, And then there's mine, and my stuff is Iron Man, it's Star Trek, and all those kinds of things. But we also kind of have the his and the hers. We also have the ours. And the ours are kind of ones that we both really like. And so usually that's not a big discussion or debate when it comes to, well, maybe we should watch one of these because we both kind of like it. But they're kind of held jointly, And some of the ones that we have that are ours are the HBO series, John Adams. Has anyone seen that? Okay, good. I liked it. Well done. I'm proud of you, too. Band of Brothers. Anyone see that? That's magnificent. Okay. Well, you know what? If you haven't seen some of these, they are pretty good, and we could rent them to you. So, just joking. One that Jen and I like a lot, and it was a series on PBS on Lewis and Clark. And this one's kind of an interesting one. It's done by Ken Burns, and it's one of those that's kind of interesting, and yet it's easy to nap to. And so it's one thing when you fall asleep when you're bored. It's another thing when you're kind of interested, but you still fall asleep, because even if you wake up, it's still kind of interesting, And so, but the other thing that's kind of appealing to us about it is that with the whole Lewis and Clark expedition, you all familiar with your history, Lewis and Clark expedition? It really touches on this part of the country. And so it holds that added interest and appeal to us. And it's pretty instructive. But Lewis and Clark in that series, they have a variety of different writers who've studied the Lewis and Clark expedition. They have historians who've done it. And so they build the series around telling the story, quotes from the diaries that they recovered, but also comments and commentary by some of the writers, like Duncan Dayton, and also Stephen Ambrose, or a couple of them that they have in that. But when the video first starts, they tell about Lewis and Clark, and they have some quotes about it, and it goes something like this. I think it was Ambrose who said in his raspy voice, "It's a great story." And Duncan Dayton, I don't know. Which one is it? Anybody know? Anyhow, they have him saying, it's an American story. And then it goes back to Ambrose, who says, it's a human story. And I think it was the last comment by Ambrose. And it's about Lewis and Clark. It's a human story. That stuck with me this week as I was looking into Luke 15. Because Luke 15 is about the prodigal. And Luke 15 is very much a human story. And it's not just a human story. It's the human story. It's my story. might be your story. But it's a fascinating story. Luke 15, starting in verse 11. It runs for a while. The danger of it is, so many of us have heard it that we think we know it. But there's some interesting things about it. So let's just plunge on into the story. Luke 15, beginning of verse 11. And Jesus said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me. And the father divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together, went on a journey to a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be in need. And he went and he attached himself to one of the citizens of that country, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. And the younger son was longing to fill his stomach with some of the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one was giving anything to him. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here of hunger? I'll get up and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Would you make me as one of your hired men? And so he got up, and he came to his father. But while he was still a far way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. And he ran and he embraced him and he kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the slaves, quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf, kill it. We are going to eat and be merry. For this son of mine was dead. He's come back to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to be merry. I'm going to stop there. Now, Father, I ask that you would, in the minutes that we have, that you would speak to us. That we would see and learn about the great story, the human story. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. How many have heard this story before? Okay. Good. I should have had him tell it. Let me take a moment to reframe it, because sometimes what happens is we're familiar with the story, but we miss some crucial things. Here's some crucial things that we miss about this story. And I hope you didn't close up your Bibles, because I'm going to point you back to chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, the very first 2 verses of the story. This is an interesting thing because this is the backdrop, and if we miss the backdrop, we don't fully appreciate the story. So what happens is if we don't recognize or don't see, here's what's going, kind of the background of this deal, then we're going to wind up with a real sentimentalized version of the story, and we miss some of the fundamental issues that Jesus wants to speak to. In Luke 15, 1 and 2, there's 2 groups of people who are listening to Jesus. Did you know that? Jesus is teaching, and as we know, he uses parables. But there's 2 groups of people that are listening to him teach. Do you see it? Luke 15, 1 and 2. Group number 1 would be those who gather, and they've kind of started listening to Jesus, and the actual verbs used means that this was something they were starting to do, not just one time. They were kind of getting in the habit of coming and listening to Jesus. There's a problem. These are some bad guys. These are clearly the outsiders. It says that they were what? Tax collectors and sinners. And basically you have to understand, sinner is a catch-all term, which simply means this. It could be, they do some bad things. It could also be they didn't really get into church and they didn't get into religion very much. So those are the folks that are listening, and they're starting to listen to Jesus again and again. And so they're following and listening to him repeatedly. Yay, God, for that, right? Maybe not. Because there's another group that's there mixed in. Do you see it? And these are the grumblers. He must be watering down the message because they wouldn't want to come listen unless he's somehow watering this down. And why are these people hanging around him? And why is he eating with them? Doesn't he know they're on the outside? Interesting, isn't it? So you have the folks who are kind of outside the church scene, and they're coming and wanting to listen. But you also have those who are on the inside of the church scene who don't seem to like it. And now Jesus tells a parable. Actually, he tells three. He tells the story of a lost sheep, remember? Remember the key components there? Shepherd, 99 sheep, and one lost, right? Then he tells a story, follows that up with a woman who's around the house, and she's looking for a coin. She's got 9, but she's still looking for the one. So there's the woman, the coin, and then the rest of the coin. But then everything gets elongated here in the story of the prodigal son. But listen, in the story of the prodigal son, there are 3 strands to this cord. There's going to be 3 storylines for us in this story. First storyline is going to be of the prodigal. Second storyline is going to be of the older brother. And the third storyline is of the father. So now you know where we're going for the next couple of weeks, right? Let's jump in on number 1, the prodigal son. And this story is a story told in 4 acts. First of all, do you know what prodigal means? Anybody? Anyone bold? Oh, don't bet your eye. I used to think it meant wayward. Doesn't mean wayward at all. You know what prodigal means? Extravagant. Right? Someone is extravagantly talented, we call them a prodigy, right? Someone has great talent, we say it's or skill. Or someone of prodigious skill. Prodigal means extravagant. Which is kind of interesting because it's going to beg the question in the story, who really is the prodigal one, the extravagant one? But here's the story, prodigal line. It starts out with a request. Did you notice what the request is? I want my part of the estate. I want my part of the inheritance. Now listen, I believe that this deal, there's a whole lot more here than what we think. We look at that, it's like, well, gee, okay, maybe we're a little bit greedy or something. But that's not really what's going on. In those times, do you know when the estate was settled? Anyone want to venture a guess? When the estate is settled in New Testament times? When the father is put in the ground. That's when the estate is settled. That's when the estate is distributed. And it usually goes this way. 2/3 to the oldest brother, 1/3, or 2/3 to the oldest, and 1/3 for everybody else. There's 2 sons, so it means 2/3 for the older brother and 1/3 for the younger. But when the younger brother comes to the father and says, I want my part now. If the estate is distributed when fathers are put in the ground, what's he telling the father? I wish you were dead. Whoa. Or maybe more precisely, I wish you were dead, but you're not. So why don't you just give me what I have coming and get out of my way? That's a very different request, isn't it? It's not just, I want some money. It's, I wish you were dead and out of my way. When I looked into that, it took me back to a time when I was much smarter than I am now. Took me back when I was probably about 16 years old. 16 years old, and I and one of my very best friends, Mark, we had gone through school together. We were on the Little League team together. We were in youth group together. We took turns as far as who was president of the class and vice president of the class. You know, every year you have your little class elections in. We were great friends, and we were on a youth trip. We're about 16. We were on a youth trip, And if you've ever done those kinds of things, you go on the youth trip, but nobody sleeps, So we had our sleeping bags rolled out. We were sleeping in a church somewhere. And we just got to talking. Anyone want to venture what we talked about? We talked about girls. And we talked about, then it kind of went from girls to parties, and then it went from parties to other stuff, and then it went to all the stuff that we're not really allowed to do, And then Mark looked at me. We were kind of doing the side-to-side thing. And Mark said, Barn, don't you ever kind of wish that somewhere they'd figure out or find out that God didn't really exist, and that way we can do what we want? And I was shocked. And I was appalled. Not at what Mark said, but that he had the guts to say what I was thinking. This is our story. It's my story, probably yours. We've all kind of played that part a little bit, I think, maybe where we kind of wished God wasn't around, that he wouldn't get in our way, so we could do what we want. That's the request that's made. Doesn't take a very far look around. See, our world is filled with people who would really, really like it if God were dead, if he wasn't around, so they could do what they want, not feel bad about it. They kind of wish him dead. It's an interesting start to the story, isn't it? But it doesn't stop there. That's Act 1. Here's Act 2. We'll move from the request to the disaster. Remember the old joke or the old saying, be careful what you wish for because you might just get it. And the younger brother comes and he makes his request and he gets it. I don't know what that would have done to the father. What that is to get that kind of request from your son. But whatever pain that brought to the father grants a request. Okay, it's yours. What I know is that there is a disaster that follows, and anytime you read it, whether even you knew the story very well or not, you get the feel from the story that this is not going to go well. And it doesn't go well. Here's what's going on. We're told some things, and we got to make sure we don't misunderstand. It says not long after he gets his part of the inheritance, he packs it up and heads not next door. He heads to a far country. Do we understand what that means? He is telling the father, sayonara. All relational ties are cut. It's not just that he received his inheritance and then hung around and just kind of had some spending money. No, he took the whole thing and he packed up and he left in such a way and to such a distance as if to say, not coming back. And we know how well that works. We're told two important things that happen from there. We're told he squandered it. Imagine. A young man with a lot of money out on his own. Could we even conceive that he might squander some money? A few years ago, I saw a fascinating article about how often professional athletes wind up in poverty. And they say, they get this large sum of money. And they go off and away. And there are plenty of folks who want to help themselves to that, and they wind up in poverty again. We see it here in Luke 15. He takes what he's got, and he heads off, and he squanders it. And then you know what happens after he squanders it? Life. It says that a famine comes. I don't know that famines ever come at good times. I don't know that natural disasters ever show up right when we were hoping they would. I do know this. Listen, reality doesn't care if you're down on your luck. A lot of times it seems like when something has gone wrong by our own hand, life kind of piles onto it. Because here's the important takeaway lesson on that, and that is reality doesn't care. Reality doesn't care that you made a few bad decisions, and so reality isn't going to just hold off and stop being reality. Famines happen. What's the saying? Everything happens for a reason, right? And sometimes the reason is you're foolish and make bad decisions. But the truth is, reality doesn't care. Sometimes hard things are going to come, but it makes life even harder when we've made foolish decisions. And that's Act 2 of the story. You following? Act 1. Father, I wish you were dead. I want what I can get from you, and then I want you out of my way. Act 2. This isn't working out so well. Not only have I squandered what I have, do you understand what he squandered? He lost what he took with him, right? He'd also lost what he'd left behind. And then life wasn't very friendly to him. That's Act 2. Here's Act 3. You can label this one the rethink. Just like Grandma Fultz used to say, them that can't listen's gotta feel. And there was a rethink. And I love the phrase that Jesus uses. When the younger brother, when he came to himself, literally is what it means, when he came to himself, what was I thinking? What was I on? Where was I going with this? He does this rethink because life has gotten bad enough that now he doesn't have a whole lot of options. And that's where he starts doing the rethink. And here's what he does. Number one, he brings to mind what life might be if he were with the Father. Interesting, isn't it? Done this one up and I've done pretty bad. I wonder what would life be if I were still there. And the second thing that he does is he resolves something. I'm going to get up and I'm going to go home and I'm going to own it and I'm going to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. It's all on me. And would you have me back? But what else is he going to do? Because when he's there and he's kind of hanging out with the pigs and eating what they don't want, he's only got 3 options that I can tell. Number 1 is just stay where he is and be hopeless. Like that's going to do anything. There's a country western song. I don't know if I'll get in trouble for this or not. We'll find out. The country western song. What is his name? Rodney Adkins. Is that right? Help me, country folks. Is there a singer named Rodney Adkins? And he sings this song about when you're going through hell. Do you remember that? And what does he say to do? Keep on going. Why would you stay? If you're in with the pigs and in with the swine, and that's where you are, what's the benefit of staying there? There is no benefit in staying there. Every now and again, I come across folks who seem to really enjoy their misery, but I never get it. I don't know why you would stay in your misery. I guess that's an option, but the younger brother here, he doesn't see that as much of an option because he decides, I'm not going to do this anymore. So then he's got 2 things before him. Either he can go home and be all hard, right? I was a jerk before, and I'm going to answer it with being even a bigger jerk now. Aren't you glad to have me back? You owe me for returning. I don't know. I see people play this out. It's like, I don't think that's going to play too well. Once you've been a big jerk, being a bigger jerk doesn't help anything. Or he lets himself be broken by what his life's come to. And he's done trying to fix blame on anything or anyone else. And he comes home and he simply owns it. I'm not proud of it, but it's mine. Here's Barney's theory about that. I think it takes an awful lot of courage to be broken. I don't think it takes much courage to be hopeless. And it takes very little courage to be hard. It takes enormous courage to be broken and to be humble. That's my theory, and here's why. Every now and then I have conversations, and over the years I've had different kinds of conversations, and I remember one time having a conversation with a particular person, and I think we got to talking about like Billy Graham, and they were talking about, well, at the end of the Billy Graham, crusades, anyone remember those? Anybody? Billy Graham. Anyone know Billy Graham, please? Okay. At the very end, he would make the appeal, right? And people would come, and they would always sing, "Just as I am." And you'd see people streaming forward to meet someone that they could pray with, to say, my life isn't really, it's been in my hands and I haven't done too good. And he said, well, I'd never do that. All these people, they're these weak people, blah, blah, blah. And so I said, maybe it's the other way. Maybe it's just that they have enough courage to own what they've done and say, this is it, this is mine, I own it, I'm not proud of it. But at least I have the courage to step up and do it. I said, I think those folks that don't, maybe they're the ones who are gutless. That they won't have the courage to come to a holy God and say, I've sinned. I've messed it up. My fingerprints are all over it. It's mine. No excuses. I think the prodigal's rethink here, when he takes the path of humility, I think that takes a lot of courage. So that's what he does, and he rehearses his statement, right? This is what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I'm not worthy anymore to be considered your son. Would you at least consider hiring me on? And he comes back, and that's his mindset. And he starts his spiel, and here's the final act of the story. The return. He goes home. And he starts his spiel. And he barely gets it done. He's expecting, I would think, at best to be diminished and dressed down, and he deserved it all. What he gets is something really different. The father says, bring the ring and the robe and the sandals. What's that about? Those were things, those were tokens given, and they were tokens of honor. They were given to those that were being welcomed in the highest and the best way. When you walk through this door and you are held with honor and you are held with value, we will give you a ring and we will give you a robe and we will give you sandals. The return that the prodigal finds when he comes, or the reception he finds when he returns, is completely unexpected. Apparently he has no idea what the Father's heart is for him. And then they say, bring the fattened calf. Everyone's celebrating because you're home. Isn't that a great story? You ever cry on your birthday? I don't usually cry on my birthday, although as the number gets higher, it starts making me a little weepy. But I do remember a time that I cried on my birthday. I was 5. And I don't know how the circumstance played out, but somehow in our family, that was before the family blew up, but in our family, I'm the youngest of 4, we wound up in the backyard of our house. We had Frisbees down for the bases, and we had one of those little balls that we use for kickball. And I don't know exactly how it played out, but I had an amazing time at the plate. every kick I had gotten somehow had landed so that I actually got a hit, and no one never caught it. And at the very end, I was there in the field, 5 years old, and the ball was rolled, and a kick was made. And I don't know how, but somehow the person who'd kicked the ball, it wound up coming right to me. And it was kicked, but not so hard that I couldn't catch it. It was almost like catching a balloon. And I caught the ball. And somehow, from catching the ball, it was declared game over. I had caught the ball. My team had won. I'd had a sterling game at the plate. I never had anyone catch the ball the whole game. And then, I think it was my mom said, "Let's go inside for root beer floats." I thought, this is great. This is great. I said, how could this be? But then she said, "Byron," she's my mother. So she said, "You need to gather up the bases and we'll go on inside." Well, those were the Frisbees on the ground, so I go. But I'm okay because I'm elated because I got the last out. And I picked up the Frisbees and I go walking in and I walk in the door. And there's my family. And there's this cake. 5 candles. I'd forgotten it was my birthday. And there's this cake with candles on it. And Byron written on it. It's even spelled right. Byron's written across that cake. And they started to sing to me. And I cried. Because that I knew of, I'd never been celebrated like that before. Bring the ring. Bring the robe. Bring the sandals. Kill the fattened calf. We're going to celebrate. Why? Because the one who had wished me dead, that then I thought was dead, has come home. Let the celebration begin. And if the prodigal never knew what the heart of the Father was for him before,